Camping in the woods had always been a peaceful getaway for me. I enjoyed the quiet, the solitude, and the chance to unplug from everyday life. This trip was meant to be no different. I drove to a secluded spot, far from the nearest town, and set up my tent beside a small, clear stream. The first day went well. I spent it fishing, reading, and exploring the forest. As the sun went down, I made a fire, cooked my meal, and enjoyed the serene sounds of nature. When night fell, the temperature dropped, and I crawled into my tent, cozy in my sleeping bag. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise, rustling outside my tent. I thought it might be an animal, so I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the rustling continued, getting closer and more deliberate. I lay still, trying to figure out what it was. My heart pounded when I heard something brushing against the tent. Then I heard the zipper of my tent start to move. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed the small knife I always kept nearby. The zipper stopped halfway, and everything went quiet again. I held my breath, clutching the knife, my eyes locked on the partially open tent flap. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, and the silence was unbearable. Then I heard it, a low, raspy breath just outside the tent. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt like someone, or something, was right there. Fear took over. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen. After what felt like forever, the zipper moved again, this time slowly being pulled down, almost as if to taunt me. I could see a shadowy shape against the dim moonlight. My mind raced with possibilities: a wild animal, a prankster camper, or something far worse. I realized I couldn't stay in the tent. I had to face whatever was outside. I gathered all my courage, pushed open the tent flap, and jumped outside with the knife in hand. The figure darted away, vanishing into the trees with a speed that felt unnatural. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the dying fire, gripping my knife, listening for any sign of the intruder's return. The forest was eerily silent, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent chills down my spine. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my gear and hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure watching me from the trees. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away, leaving the campsite behind, but the memory of that night lingered. I never camped alone again. The woods, once a haven, had become a source of dread. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Every time I walked through the forest or heard a rustle in the distance, I felt that same chill, the unsettling sense that I was still being watched, that whatever was out there had not gone away but was simply waiting, hidden just beyond the light. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks. The trail was deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town. I had read that the view from the top was worth it. I packed my backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty flashlight. The morning of the hike was clear and cool. I parked my car at the start of the trail and began my journey. The first few miles were easy, with a well-marked path and gentle slopes. I enjoyed the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves underfoot. As I climbed higher, the path became steeper and the forest thicker. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the sunlight. Around midday, I reached a clearing and took a break. I drank some water and ate a granola bar while taking in the view. The silence was almost creepy. No wind, no animals, just the occasional drip of water from the leaves. I felt a chill even though the sun was warm. Continuing on, the trail became rougher. Rocks and roots stuck out, making each step tricky. I focused on my steps, careful not to twist an ankle. The trail was harder to see here, and I had to rely on the occasional trail marker to stay on track. I saw fewer and fewer of these markers as I went on, but I kept going, sure I was still on the right path. Hours passed, and the sky began to darken. I checked my watch and realized I had less time than I thought. I sped up, hoping to reach the top before nightfall. The trail became almost invisible, and I had to guess my way forward. My heart started to pound with the effort and worry of getting lost. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and fell hard. Pain shot through my ankle. I cursed under my breath and sat up, testing my weight on the hurt foot. It hurt, but I could still walk. I looked around and realized I had no idea where I was. The trail had vanished completely. Panic started to set in as the sun went down. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beams seemed weak and flickered. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could find my way back if I retraced my steps carefully. I marked trees with scratches from a pocket knife as I walked, hoping to avoid going in circles. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker and colder. My flashlight finally died, leaving me in complete darkness. I moved slowly, feeling my way through the underbrush. Every sound made me jump, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, my own breathing echoing in the silence. Then I heard something different. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. It grew louder, closer. I held my breath, hoping whoever or whatever it was would pass me by. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't dare move, barely breathing. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, I gathered the courage to move, inching forward as quietly as possible. I stepped on a twig, and it snapped loudly in the stillness. The footsteps started again, this time faster, more determined. Panic surged through me. I stumbled and fell again, cutting my hand on a sharp rock. Pain and fear blurred my thoughts. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring where I was going, branches whipping my face and arms. The footsteps followed, relentless. I could feel someone or something getting closer. Suddenly, I broke through the trees into another clearing. The moonlight showed a small cabin in the distance. I ran towards it, my injured ankle screaming in pain. I reached the door and pounded on it, desperate for help. No answer. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. I stumbled inside and bolted the door behind me. The cabin was empty, abandoned. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. The footsteps stopped outside. I listened, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Minutes passed, then hours. I stayed awake, too scared to sleep. When dawn finally broke, I slowly opened the door. There were no signs of anyone, or anything, outside. I limped back to the trailhead, every step a painful reminder of the night before. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I never found out who, or what, was in the forest that night. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees, something that knew I had seen too much. The mountains were beautiful, but they held secrets I didn't want to uncover. And I knew that whatever was out there, it was still waiting for me. I wanted to escape everything for a bit, so I decided to go camping alone in the mountains. I packed my stuff and left early in the morning, driving for hours until I reached the start of the trail. The air was fresh, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. After hiking for a few hours, I found a nice spot to set up my tent near a small clearing. It was far away from everything, just what I wanted. I spent the day looking around, gathering firewood, and enjoying the peace. As the sun began to set, I made a small fire and cooked some dinner. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, and I felt completely at ease. Night fell quickly. The darkness in the mountains is different, deeper than in the city. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual noises of crickets and distant animal calls were soothing at first. But then, I heard something strange. A rustling noise louder than the wind or the small animals I was used to hearing. It seemed to come from just beyond my campfire's light. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer or some other harmless animal. But the noise didn't stop, it kept moving closer. My heart started to race. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. I couldn't see anything unusual, just trees and bushes. I turned off the light and tried to calm down, but the noise didn't stop. In fact, it was getting louder, more deliberate. I decided to get out of my tent to check it out. With my flashlight in hand, I carefully walked towards the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, showing nothing strange. I took a few more steps, and then I saw it. A figure, just on the edge of the light, standing still, watching me. I froze. It was a person, but something was off. They were too still, too silent. I called out, but there was no response. The figure just stood there, not moving. Panic surged through me. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. As I moved back, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. I turned and ran back to my tent, heart pounding. I grabbed my keys and my backpack, not bothering to pack everything neatly. I just wanted to get out. As I fumbled with the zipper, I heard the footsteps, slow and steady, coming closer. I broke into a full sprint towards my car, not daring to look back. When I reached the car, I jumped in and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The headlights lit up the path back to the main road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching as I sped away. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak in the house, every shadow, brought back the terror of that night. Weeks later, I noticed strange things around my home. Footprints in the garden, the feeling of being watched, small noises outside my windows at night. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it persisted. One night, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps inside my house. My heart pounded as I lay there, too scared to move. I heard my bedroom door creak open, but I couldn't bring myself to look. The feeling of a cold, silent presence filled the room, and I knew, without a doubt, that the figure had followed me home. I was excited to explore the far-off trails of the Cascade Mountains. The cool autumn air greeted me as I started my hike early one Saturday morning. The path twisted through thick pine forests, sunlight peeking through the trees and making strange shapes on the ground. I walked deeper into the wilderness, following the trail markers that assured me I was going the right way. Around noon, though, the markers became sparse, like the trail was fading into the bushes. As I kept going, I realized I hadn't seen another person for hours. The forest grew quieter, just the crunch of leaves under my feet. I felt a bit nervous being alone out there, but I pushed it aside. As the sun started to set, I decided to turn back, hoping to get back to the start before dark. But trying to find my way back was useless. The markers I had followed confidently had disappeared completely. Panic set in when I realized I was lost. With the light fading and no clear path, I stumbled through the woods, each step more unsure than the last. Shadows moved around me, and every sound made my heart race. Just as despair was about to take over, I saw a faint light through the trees. With hope, I moved towards it, praying it wasn't just my tired mind playing tricks. Stepping into a small clearing, I saw a familiar sight, a fallen tree I had passed earlier. Relief washed over me as I recognized where I was. Following the familiar ground, I finally found my way back to the main trail. Tired but relieved, I walked back to the start under the moonlit sky, promising myself never to underestimate the wilderness again. It wasn't just about getting back safe, but a lesson learned: the wild is unpredictable and demands respect. I'd always been a big fan of camping. The smell of pine trees, the crackling of the fire, and the calm of the night were what I considered perfect. So, when my friends canceled our yearly camping trip, I decided to go by myself. It wouldn't be as fun without them, but I still liked the idea of being alone in the wilderness. I set up my tent in a remote spot deep in the woods. As the sun went down, everything turned dark blue and gray. The only sounds were distant bird calls and the rustling of the wind through the trees. I started a fire and got comfy, roasting marshmallows and telling myself creepy stories to add some excitement to the night. Around midnight, I heard a noise that made my heart race. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy hitting the ground. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just normal forest sounds. But as the night went on, the thumping got louder and more distinct. It wasn't just random, it seemed deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked toward the noise, trying to calm my pounding heart. The forest was thick, and each step made the silence around me feel even more intense. The thumping continued, now with an occasional scraping sound, like something was dragging along the ground. I reached a small open area and saw what was making the noise, a large, old tree stump with sticks and branches around it. The thumping seemed to be coming from under the stump. I carefully moved some of the debris and, to my shock, found a worn-out box. It was partly buried and had clearly been there for ages. With shaking hands, I opened the box. Inside, I found old, rusty tools, broken glass, and some scraps of cloth. Nothing seemed immediately dangerous, but the unsettling feeling grew stronger. I decided it was best to cover the box back up and head back to my campsite. When I got back to my tent, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The thumping had stopped, but I couldn't relax. Every little noise seemed louder in the stillness of the night. At dawn, I packed up quickly. As I was loading my stuff into the car, I noticed something chilling, deep scratch marks on the side of my tent, like something had tried to get inside. My heart pounded as I realized how close I might have come to something truly horrifying. I left the campsite as fast as I could, my mind racing with what I had found and what might have been lurking in the woods. When I reached the safety of the main road, I looked back at the forest one last time. It looked peaceful, but I knew better now. As unsettling as the night had been, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The box and the scratches were clues that something had been there. But the real terror was the thought that whatever had left those marks was still out there, watching me from the shadows. It wasn't just a bad night, it was a warning. We had been planning the camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a break from the daily grind, a chance to connect with nature and leave the city's noise behind. We picked a remote spot in the mountains, far from any main roads or towns. It took nearly half a day to hike there, and by the time we arrived, the sun was already beginning to set. We set up our tents near a small, clear stream. The surroundings were perfect: tall trees, chirping birds, and the soothing sound of running water. After getting everything in place, we built a fire and cooked our dinner. The food tasted better than it ever had before, probably because we were tired and hungry from the hike. The stars were bright, and the night was peaceful. As we settled into our tents, I felt calm. The cool air, the sound of the stream, and the rustling leaves put me to sleep. It was around midnight when I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It was footsteps, and they were getting closer. I lay still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, heavy and slow. I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking. I switched it on and pointed the light towards the tent's entrance. There was nothing there. Trying to calm myself, I convinced myself it must have been my imagination. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal passing by. I turned off the flashlight and tried to go back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound seemed louder, and the darkness felt heavier. A few hours later, just as I was beginning to drift off again, I heard it. A low, deep growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scratching at the tent. I froze, my mind racing. This was no animal I had ever heard before. The growling continued, and then I heard another sound, something being dragged through the bushes, slow and deliberate. I couldn't stay in the tent any longer. I had to see what it was, no matter how scared I was. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked outside. The moonlight cast long shadows, but I could see the outlines of the trees and the stream. And then I saw it, a figure, hunched and dragging something behind it. It wasn't until the figure moved into a patch of moonlight that I saw what it was dragging, a large, heavy bag, covered in dirt and leaves. I watched in horror as it heaved the bag over its shoulder and disappeared into the woods. I sat there, unable to move, for what felt like forever. When I finally got the courage to check it out, the figure was long gone, but the tracks were still there, leading deeper into the forest. At dawn, I woke my friends, and we packed up our camp in silence. We didn't discuss what I had seen. I wasn't even sure they would believe me. We hiked back to our car and left the mountains behind. I never went back to that place, and I never told anyone about what happened that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I hear that growl again. I wonder who or what was out there in the woods with us, and what was inside that bag it was dragging. And then I think about those tracks leading into the forest, and I can't help but feel a chill. What if it wasn't done? What if it's still out there, watching and waiting? What if it comes back? I decided to go camping alone in the woods for the first time. I needed a break from city life, and spending a night under the stars sounded perfect. I found a spot near a small, calm lake, surrounded by thick trees. It was quiet and peaceful. After setting up my tent, I gathered some wood and started a campfire. The crackling fire was comforting as the sun began to set. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, reflecting beautifully off the water. I cooked a simple meal and enjoyed the quiet. Everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, I heard the sounds of the forest coming alive. The hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the distant croak of frogs filled the night. I felt a bit uneasy but told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, until I felt tired. I put out the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was cooler than I expected, and the only light came from the moon shining through the trees. I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was a low, growling sound, unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart raced. I lay still, listening closely. The noise continued, getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. Something big was moving outside. I quietly reached for my flashlight and my camping knife. My hand shook as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The sound stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear any movement, but there was only silence. After what felt like forever, I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The night was still and quiet again. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I decided it was probably an animal, and that I was overreacting. I closed the tent and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed louder, keeping me on edge. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming into the tent. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside carefully. The area around my campsite looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I packed up my gear, ready to leave the woods. As I was folding my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were large footprints in the dirt, much larger than any human or common animal. They led away from my campsite and into the deeper parts of the forest. I decided not to stick around to investigate further. I finished packing and hiked back to my car as quickly as possible. The whole way back, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away from the woods, vowing to never camp alone again. The peace and quiet I had wanted turned into a night I would never forget, a reminder of how small we are in the wild. I made it home safely, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made those footprints was still out there, watching. From then on, I always made sure to camp with friends, never alone. Nature is beautiful, but it has its own rules and dangers. Sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I can still hear those footsteps crunching in the leaves. I wonder if it followed me home, waiting for the right moment to remind me that out there, in the dark, I'm never truly alone. I set out for a solo camping trip in the thick woods a few miles from town. I needed a break from my routine, and hoped being alone would clear my head. The drive was smooth, and I got to my campsite in the late afternoon. I parked my car, grabbed my stuff, and headed into the forest. The trees grew denser the further I went. After about an hour, I found a small open area by a stream. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and lit a small campfire. As the sun went down, the forest around me turned into a world of shadows and sounds. I tried to ignore the rustling in the bushes and the occasional snap of a twig. The night got colder. I wrapped myself in a blanket, sitting by the fire, lost in thought. That's when I first heard it. A faint rustling, different from the usual sounds of the forest. It was deliberate, moving closer. I turned my flashlight toward the sound but saw nothing. I tried to brush it off as an animal, but a chill ran down my spine. I decided to get some sleep, hoping to shake off the unease. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down. The forest was eerily quiet now, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. The same rustling, but now it was right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, listening closely. The sound circled my tent slowly, purposefully. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The rustling stopped. I waited, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept listening, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again, louder this time. It was followed by a soft thud, like something heavy had been dropped nearby. Fear gripped me. I knew I wasn't alone out here. I didn't dare make a sound. Morning couldn't come soon enough. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I packed my gear quickly. The forest, which seemed so inviting in the daylight, now felt menacing. As I was leaving the clearing, I saw it, a deep, fresh footprint in the soft earth near my tent. It was human and much larger than my own. My heart raced as I realized someone had been watching me all night. I hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me the entire way. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Just as I turned onto the main road, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. My blood ran cold. I sped up, not daring to look back again. I promised myself I'd never camp alone again. But even now, days later, I can't get rid of the feeling that I'm still being watched. Everywhere I go, I feel those eyes on me. At home, at work, even in crowded places. I haven't slept well since that night, and I'm starting to see shadows in the corners of my eyes. Whoever, or whatever, was out there is not done with me yet. And I can't escape the chilling thought that one night, when I'm least expecting it, they'll come back for me. Camping in the woods had always been a peaceful getaway for me. I enjoyed the quiet, the solitude, and the chance to unplug from everyday life. This trip was meant to be no different. I drove to a secluded spot, far from the nearest town, and set up my tent beside a small, clear stream. The first day went well. I spent it fishing, reading, and exploring the forest. As the sun went down, I made a fire, cooked my meal, and enjoyed the serene sounds of nature. When night fell, the temperature dropped, and I crawled into my tent, cozy in my sleeping bag. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise, rustling outside my tent. I thought it might be an animal, so I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the rustling continued, getting closer and more deliberate. I lay still, trying to figure out what it was. My heart pounded when I heard something brushing against the tent. Then I heard the zipper of my tent start to move. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed the small knife I always kept nearby. The zipper stopped halfway, and everything went quiet again. I held my breath, clutching the knife, my eyes locked on the partially open tent flap. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, and the silence was unbearable. Then I heard it, a low, raspy breath just outside the tent. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt like someone, or something, was right there. Fear took over. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen. After what felt like forever, the zipper moved again, this time slowly being pulled down, almost as if to taunt me. I could see a shadowy shape against the dim moonlight. My mind raced with possibilities: a wild animal, a prankster camper, or something far worse. I realized I couldn't stay in the tent. I had to face whatever was outside. I gathered all my courage, pushed open the tent flap, and jumped outside with the knife in hand. The figure darted away, vanishing into the trees with a speed that felt unnatural. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat by the dying fire, gripping my knife, listening for any sign of the intruder's return. The forest was eerily silent, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent chills down my spine. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my gear and hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure watching me from the trees. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away, leaving the campsite behind, but the memory of that night lingered. I never camped alone again. The woods, once a haven, had become a source of dread. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Every time I walked through the forest or heard a rustle in the distance, I felt that same chill, the unsettling sense that I was still being watched, that whatever was out there had not gone away but was simply waiting, hidden just beyond the light. Camping was supposed to be my getaway, a break from the noisy city. I picked a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any trails. I got there in the early afternoon, set up my tent, and gathered some firewood. The forest was peaceful, the air fresh, and the sounds of nature were soothing. As the sun started to go down, I built a fire and cooked dinner. It was perfect, just what I needed. Night came fast, and with it, an uneasy quiet. The usual forest sounds seemed to vanish, replaced by a creepy silence. I brushed it off, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard a rustling outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the sounds were too careful, too human. My heart raced as I lay still, listening. The rustling turned into footsteps, slow and cautious, moving around my campsite. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. The footsteps grew louder, stopping right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, heavy and strained. Fear took hold of me as I lay there, frozen, trying to stay quiet. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to move. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent slowly. My campsite looked untouched, but I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. As I was about to leave, I noticed something on the ground near my tent. It was a footprint, clearly human, leading away from my camp and into the woods. I didn't waste any more time. I hurried back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I drove away, leaving the forest behind, but the memory of that night stayed with me. It wasn't until I got home and did some searching that I found out about the disappearances. Several campers had gone missing in that forest over the past few years. The footprints and the creepy silence now made sense. I had been lucky to make it out. The experience changed me. I still enjoy the outdoors, but I never camp alone anymore. The forest, once a place of peace, now holds a dark memory. The fear of the unknown, of what might be lurking in the shadows, is something I can't forget. The footsteps outside my tent, the feeling of being watched, it's all too real, a reminder of how close I came to disappearing into the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. They start slow and cautious, just like that night, circling my bed instead of my tent. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced that if I close my eyes again, I'll open them to find those footprints leading right into my room. The forest may be far away, but the terror it left behind is always with me. I'd been excited about this camping trip for weeks, needing a break from the constant noise and stress of everyday life. My friend and I picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any campgrounds. The place was ideal, quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by tall pine trees. We set up our tent in the late afternoon, and as night came, we started a small fire. The crackling flames and the smell of burning wood were soothing. I'd brought my guitar along and played a few chords, enjoying the peace. After a while, my friend went to bed, leaving me alone by the fire. The forest was dark and still. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and a distant owl hooting. Around midnight, I heard something strange, a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the woods. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal. But as the thumping went on, I started to feel uneasy. It was too regular, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and walked towards the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, showing nothing but trees and bushes. The thumping stopped as soon as I got close, and the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Back at the campfire, I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I threw more wood on the fire and sat by the flames, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The firelight flickered across the trees, casting long, spooky shadows. After a while, I heard the thumping again, but it was closer this time. It was louder and more urgent. My heart pounded in my chest. I picked up a heavy stick for protection and went back into the woods, determined to find out what was making the noise. I ventured deeper, the thumping growing louder with each step. I felt like I was being led somewhere, and my anxiety grew. Then I saw it, a large, rough hole in the ground, freshly dug and about 6 feet deep. The thumping noise was coming from below, a dull, rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the earth. My mind raced. I realized someone, or something, was down there. The thumping grew more frantic, like whoever was down there was desperate to get out. I stumbled back to the campsite, my heart racing. I packed up our gear quickly, my hands shaking as I worked. I couldn't leave without my friend, so I woke them and told them we had to leave right away. We packed up as fast as we could and drove away from that place, the thumping sound still ringing in my ears. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our own thoughts. When we got home, I told the local authorities about what happened. They investigated but found no signs of recent activity or anyone in trouble. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrifying. To this day, the thought of that rhythmic thumping chills me to the bone. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that sound in my head, a haunting reminder of what might have been waiting for us in that hole. I can't help but wonder if it was someone trapped or something far more sinister, and whether it's still out there, waiting for the next unwary camper to wander too close. I'd been looking forward to this weekend camping trip for weeks. I needed a break from the constant noise and stress of city life and thought a couple of days in the woods would be just what I needed. I got to the campsite late in the afternoon and set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. As the sun went down, long shadows stretched across the clearing, and I felt a chill I attributed to the evening air. I built a fire and cooked some food, enjoying the crackling flames and the calm of the forest. As night settled in, The only sounds were leaves rustling and the occasional call of distant animals. I felt a bit uneasy, but I chalked it up to being in a new place. I decided to go to bed early so I could get a good night's sleep and explore the area in the morning. Just as I was starting to drift off, a series of loud, strange noises outside jolted me awake. It sounded like something heavy was moving around, and I could hear twigs snapping. My heart raced, and I tried to ignore it, but the noises continued. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the dark. The light from my flashlight swept over the campsite, but I saw nothing unusual. I turned off the light and listened closely, trying to figure out what was making the noise. It seemed to be getting closer. I felt a growing sense of fear. Deciding to check things out, I thought maybe an animal had come into my campsite. I stepped outside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The noises had stopped, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. I walked around the clearing, shining the light everywhere. I soon noticed something unsettling: large, human-like footprints in the dirt. They were deep and heavy, leading away from my tent and into the woods. Panic hit me hard. I didn't want to be alone in the woods anymore, but I had to find out what was going on. I followed the footprints carefully, trying to stay as quiet as I could. The forest was dense, and the darkness was nearly total. As I went further into the woods, I stumbled upon a small, makeshift campfire and some scattered belongings: an old backpack, a torn blanket, and a half-empty water bottle. The sight made my blood run cold. Someone had been here recently. The thought of not being alone made my heart race even faster. I scanned the area and saw a shadowy figure in the distance. It was too dark to make out any details, but it looked like a person. I froze, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to leave immediately. I turned and ran back to my tent, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached my tent, quickly packed up my things, and decided to leave right away. Relief washed over me when I was finally in my car, speeding away from the campsite. As I drove, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was as if the eyes of the forest were still on me. The next morning, I reported what I had seen to the local authorities. They promised they would look into it. When I went back to the area a week later, everything had been cleaned up. There were no signs of the previous occupant. The authorities said someone had been living in the woods for a while but had left before they arrived. That experience left me shaken. I learned the hard way that the wilderness is unpredictable and can be much more dangerous than I ever imagined. To this day, I still feel uneasy about that trip. The thought of what might have happened if I had stayed a bit longer makes my skin crawl. The sense of being watched never quite left me, and I wonder if there are still eyes in the dark woods, waiting for the next camper to come too close. It was a clear night when I decided to go camping alone. I found a quiet spot by a lake deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The air was cool, the stars bright, and the only sound was the gentle splash of water against the shore. I set up my tent and built a small fire, feeling happy in the silence. As the fire crackled, I noticed the forest seemed oddly still. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. It felt strange, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was because I was far from everything. After cooking a simple meal, I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire to burn down to embers. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. My heart was racing, and I didn't know why. I listened carefully, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was coming from the direction of the trees. My first thought was an animal, but the steps were too slow and steady. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. The moonlight cast long shadows across the campsite, but I saw nothing unusual. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was eerily quiet again. I sat there, straining my ears, when the sound started again, this time closer. My skin crawled with fear. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it towards the noise. The light cut through the darkness, but showed nothing. The steps stopped again. Whoever, or whatever, it was, seemed to be playing a game, staying just out of sight. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time I thought it was safe to relax, the footsteps would start up again, never coming too close, but never leaving. By dawn, I was exhausted but glad to see the sun rise. I decided to pack up and leave. The forest that had seemed peaceful now felt threatening. As I took down my tent, I felt eyes on me, watching my every move. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what might be there. Walking back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I half expected to see someone or something following me, but the path stayed empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. At the edge of the woods, just visible in the morning light, was a figure. It stood still, watching me leave. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it had been there all night, stalking me. Weeks passed, and I tried to forget about that night. But the memory of those footsteps in the dark, and the figure in the woods, stayed with me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the same faint crunching sound outside my window. My heart pounded as I got up and looked out, but saw nothing. The steps stopped, and the silence was deafening. That's when I realized, whatever had been watching me in the woods had followed me home. The plan was simple, a solo camping trip to clear my mind. I drove out to a quiet forest, found a hidden spot by a small creek, and set up my tent. The first day was perfect. I walked around a bit, fished, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. By nightfall, I had a small fire going and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't an animal. It was a faint, steady tapping, like something or someone was hitting a tree. I ignored it, thinking it was just the forest's noises, and tried to go back to sleep. The tapping continued, getting closer and louder. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent, looking around. The sound stopped suddenly. Everything was still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I went back inside the tent, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, listening closely. Then I heard something new, soft footsteps circling my campsite. I gripped my knife, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew bolder, closer, until they stopped just outside the tent. For what felt like forever, I listened, waiting for something to happen. Then, the tent fabric rustled slightly, as if something brushed against it. I held my breath. Suddenly, the tent flaps started to open. My mind raced. I had no time to think. I lunged forward, knife in hand, and slashed wildly at the darkness. The sound stopped. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight and knife ready. There was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. Just the empty forest, silent and dark. My hands were shaking. I couldn't stay here. I quickly packed up my stuff, throwing everything into my backpack, and started heading back to my car. As I walked, the feeling of being watched never left. Every rustle, every snap of a twig, sent shivers down my spine. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But the forest stayed empty and silent. I reached my car just as the first light of dawn broke. I tossed my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were still trembling as I started the engine and sped away from the campsite. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of those eyes on me, watching. I haven't been camping since. The forest that once felt like a safe place now feels like a trap. Every night, I lock my doors and windows, haunted by the memory of that tapping sound, wondering who or what it was that found me in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I hear it again. That same faint, steady tapping, as if it's coming from the trees outside my window. I know it's impossible. but the fear grips me all the same. I lie awake, staring into the dark, wondering if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or if something truly found me that night and followed me home. I decided to go camping alone in the woods for the first time. I needed a break from city life, and spending a night under the stars sounded perfect. I found a spot near a small, calm lake, surrounded by thick trees. It was quiet and peaceful. After setting up my tent, I gathered some wood and started a campfire. The crackling fire was comforting as the sun began to set. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, reflecting beautifully off the water. I cooked a simple meal and enjoyed the quiet. Everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, I heard the sounds of the forest coming alive. The hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the distant croak of frogs filled the night. I felt a bit uneasy but told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, until I felt tired. I put out the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was cooler than I expected, and the only light came from the moon shining through the trees. I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was a low, growling sound, unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart raced. I lay still, listening closely. The noise continued, getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. Something big was moving outside. I quietly reached for my flashlight and my camping knife. My hand shook as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The sound stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear any movement, but there was only silence. After what felt like forever, I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The night was still and quiet again. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I decided it was probably an animal, and that I was overreacting. I closed the tent and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed louder, keeping me on edge. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming into the tent. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside carefully. The area around my campsite looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I packed up my gear, ready to leave the woods. As I was folding my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were large footprints in the dirt, much larger than any human or common animal. They led away from my campsite and into the deeper parts of the forest. I decided not to stick around to investigate further. I finished packing and hiked back to my car as quickly as possible. The whole way back, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away from the woods, vowing to never camp alone again. The peace and quiet I had wanted turned into a night I would never forget, a reminder of how small we are in the wild. I made it home safely, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made those footprints was still out there, watching. From then on, I always made sure to camp with friends, never alone. Nature is beautiful, but it has its own rules and dangers. Sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I can still hear those footsteps crunching in the leaves. I wonder if it followed me home, waiting for the right moment to remind me that out there, in the dark, I'm never truly alone. I had always liked the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin far from everything. The thought of getting away from the constant noise and rush of the city for a few days seemed perfect. So, when I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, I booked it without a second thought. The drive was long and twisty, but the scenery was beautiful. Tall trees lined the narrow road, and the only sounds were the occasional bird calls and the hum of my car's engine. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just as perfect as I had imagined. It was a small, wooden house with a porch that overlooked a clear, sparkling lake. The first day was peaceful. I spent the afternoon reading a book on the porch, occasionally looking up to enjoy the view. As the sun set, the sky turned bright orange and pink, and I felt completely at peace. I cooked a simple dinner and settled in for the night. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the leaves outside. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or a deer. But then, the sound got louder, and I could hear footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps, crunching the leaves and twigs outside the cabin. I froze, listening carefully. My heart started to pound, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I reminded myself that I was in the middle of nowhere. It could be anything. But the footsteps continued, moving closer to the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me and slowly moved towards the window. Peeking through the curtain, I looked out into the dark forest but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, trying to calm my racing thoughts. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal passing by. The next day, I tried to forget about the night before. I went for a hike, explored the woods around the cabin, and took some pictures of the beautiful scenery. But I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of those footsteps. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I went to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would help me feel better. But around midnight the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder and closer than before. I could hear them walking around the cabin, slow and steady. I sat up in bed, holding the flashlight tightly. The sound of the footsteps stopped right outside the front door. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch floorboards, followed by a light tapping on the door. Fear gripped me. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. Whoever or whatever was outside, I didn't want to find out. I waited until the sound stopped, and the silence stretched on for what felt like hours. When I was sure it was safe, I quietly gathered my things, grabbed my keys, and made my way to the car. The drive back felt endless. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the road stayed empty, and I eventually reached the highway. When I got home, I felt a wave of relief. I never found out who or what was outside the cabin that night. But the thought still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear those footsteps in my mind. Slow, deliberate, getting closer and closer. And I wonder if someday, they'll find me again. I went camping alone in the woods, far from any town or other people. I always loved the peace and quiet of nature, and this trip was meant to be a break from my busy life. I set up my tent near a small open space and started a fire. As the sun began to set, I felt a strange unease. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just being paranoid. After dinner, I sat by the fire, enjoying the sounds of the forest. The crackling fire, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, it was perfect. But then, I noticed something weird. The usual sounds of the forest seemed to stop. The rustling leaves were silent, and the owl didn't hoot anymore. It felt like everything was holding its breath. I decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would come quickly and calm me down. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, lying down in my sleeping bag. The silence outside was creepy, but I tried to ignore it. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps were slow and deliberate, getting closer to my tent. I lay still, barely breathing, trying to hear every sound. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight and shone it towards the tent wall. The light cast shadows, but I couldn't see anything. Then, the tent fabric moved slightly, like something or someone was brushing against it. I froze, my mind racing with thoughts of who, or what, could be out there. Suddenly, the zipper of my tent started to open. My heart was in my throat. I grabbed my knife, my only means of defense, and waited. The zipper opened a few inches, then stopped. There was silence for what felt like forever. Then, the zipper quickly zipped back up, and I heard the footsteps walking away into the woods. I lay there shaking until dawn. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up my gear and left. I didn't look back. I never found out what or who was out there that night. The woods felt different now, no longer a place of peace, but of hidden dangers. I decided that was my last solo camping trip. The feeling of being watched, of being vulnerable, stayed with me long after I returned home. Weeks later, I was watching the news when I saw a report about a missing person last seen near the same woods where I camped. The thought that I might have had a close encounter with whoever was responsible made my blood run cold. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The image of that slowly opening tent zipper haunts my dreams, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I think I hear those footsteps again. It was a calm evening when I set up my tent in the thick forest. The air was cool, and I could hear all sorts of sounds from nature. I had been hiking for hours and was looking forward to sleeping under the stars. Being alone in the woods was peaceful, and I felt free. After a simple dinner, I decided to go to bed early. The forest was dark, and the only light came from the moon and my small campfire. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the crickets and the leaves rustling. The forest felt alive, but I was used to these sounds. They were normal, even comforting. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and the fire had gone out. There was a weird silence, the kind that makes you feel uneasy. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it. A faint, uneven crunching sound. It was slow, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too heavy. My heart pounded as I listened closely, trying to figure out what it could be. The steps got closer and stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to hear any movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath too. Then, there was a soft scraping against the tent fabric, like someone or something was feeling around. My mind raced. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I could feel someone outside, a sense of being watched. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably just minutes. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The forest was silent again. I waited, not moving, listening for any sign of the intruder. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell back into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was dawn. Light filtered through the trees, and the forest was alive with morning sounds. I slowly unzipped my tent and looked around. There were no signs of anything strange. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing out of place. It was as if the night had been a bad dream. But as I packed up my gear, I noticed something. On the ground, right next to my tent, was a single, muddy handprint. It was human, and it was fresh. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly finished packing and started my hike back to civilization, the feeling of unease never leaving me. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. Part of me wants to believe it was just a prank, maybe another camper messing around. But the memory of that handprint, and the feeling of being watched, stays with me. When I got home, I looked up stories about people disappearing in the woods. The more I read, the more I realized how many of them talked about strange noises and muddy handprints. It wasn't just me. Whatever was out there, it was real, and it was watching. That handprint was a reminder that sometimes, the most frightening things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown, lurking just outside our safe spaces. And that night in the forest, I came face to face with that unknown. The night was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. I'd been camping alone for 2 nights, and while I was used to being alone, the silence was unsettling. The campfire crackled softly, its weak light casting strange shadows on the trees around me. Around midnight I heard something. It was a faint, unmistakable sound, like the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was just the forest settling down for the night. Animals are known to wander, right? I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling and crawled into my sleeping bag, letting the dying embers of the fire glow faintly. Hours later, I woke up suddenly. The noise had come back, and it was closer this time. My heart raced as I lay still, straining to listen. The footsteps seemed to be moving in circles around the campsite, with the crunches and pauses forming a strange pattern. My flashlight was next to me, so I reached for it carefully, trying not to make any sudden moves. When I turned on the light, the beam cut through the darkness. I looked around the campsite but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar shape of my tent and the smoldering remains of the fire. Despite this, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I decided to check things out, grabbing a stick for protection, even though I knew it wouldn't be much help if there was really someone out there. I stepped out of the tent and looked around. The footsteps had stopped, and the only sounds were the occasional crackle of dying embers and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. I walked slowly around the edge of the camp, the flashlight cutting through the dark. Everything seemed normal, but the tension in the air was thick. Then I saw something. Not far from my tent, partially hidden under a bush, were large, muddy footprints. They were definitely not mine, too big and too deep. They led off into the forest, disappearing into the underbrush. My stomach twisted as I realized someone, or something, had been watching me. I quickly packed my gear and decided to leave. There was no way I was staying another minute. As I hurriedly packed, every little sound seemed magnified, and the dark forest looked even more menacing. The walk to my car felt like it took forever, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making me jump. When I finally reached my car and drove away, I glanced back at the dark outline of the forest. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the tension easing only when the trees were far behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something far more terrifying than just strange noises. It wasn't until I got home and checked my gear that I noticed something chilling. One of the muddy footprints was now in the back seat of my car. The unmistakable print was fresh, and it was clear that someone, or something, had been following me all the way to my vehicle. We were deep in the woods, miles away from any town. My friends and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. We wanted a break from the city, to enjoy nature, and just unwind. At first, everything was perfect. The weather was ideal, the sky was clear, and the forest was calm. The first day went by without a hitch. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and cooked dinner over it. We laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the evening. As the fire burned low, we decided to head to bed and went to our tents. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was a faint rustling, like something moving through the leaves. I thought it was just a small animal and tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it again, and it was closer this time. I sat up, straining to hear better. The rustling now had a low, steady crunching sound with it, like footsteps on the ground. I unzipped my tent and looked outside. The moonlight made long shadows through the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. I listened carefully, my heart racing. The footsteps were getting closer, moving slowly but surely toward our campsite. Feeling scared, I grabbed the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. I shone it in the direction of the noise, but the light only revealed trees and darkness. The footsteps were now only a few feet away. I called out to my friends, but there was no answer. They were all sound asleep, unaware of the danger. I decided to check it out, hoping to find a reasonable explanation for the noises. I stepped out of my tent, trying to be as quiet as I could. The night air was cold, and the forest was eerily silent except for the crunching of the footsteps. I moved toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I froze and swept the area with my light. There was nothing, just trees and shadows. A shiver ran down my spine, and I decided to go back to the campsite. As I turned around, I saw something on the ground, fresh footprints, larger than any of ours, leading away from our tents and into the darkness. I rushed back to my tent, my mind racing. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, listening for any sign of movement. When the sun finally came up, I woke my friends and showed them the footprints. They were just as confused and uneasy as I was. We quickly packed up our gear and left the forest. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in thought. The feeling of being watched, of something hiding in the shadows, lingered with us. We never found out who or what was out there that night. As we left, we noticed that the forest seemed even more oppressive and dark. It was as if it was hiding something that didn't want to be found. And we were all too relieved to be out of its grasp, hoping that whatever had followed us wouldn't dare come near us again. I decided to go camping alone for a weekend to clear my head and enjoy some quiet. I found a spot deep in the forest, far from any town. The first day was great. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun went down, the forest around me got dark and silent. I felt calm as I watched the fire. That night I slept well. The sounds of the forest were relaxing. The next day, I walked around the area. I found a small stream and followed it for a bit. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and I felt at peace. When I got back to my campsite, I saw something strange. My backpack was open, and some of my food was gone. I thought maybe an animal had taken it, so I tied my things up better. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard rustling in the bushes. I thought it was a small animal, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to be getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the noise. There was nothing there. I felt nervous, but I tried to brush it off. Eventually, I went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud snap. My heart pounded as I listened. It sounded like footsteps. They were slow and heavy, moving around my tent. I held my breath, hoping it was just my imagination. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could see a shadow through the fabric. It was a person. I didn't know what to do. I stayed as still and quiet as I could. After what felt like forever, the shadow moved away. I waited a long time before I dared to unzip my tent and look outside. There was no one there. I packed my things as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't care that it was still dark. I needed to leave. As I hiked back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. When I finally reached my car, I felt a huge sense of relief. I drove away, my hands shaking. But as I turned onto the main road, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching me. I don't know who or what it was, but I realized then that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Now I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched, even at home. Every creak, every rustle, sends chills down my spine. Camping alone seemed like a good idea, but now I know some places are better left alone.